only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
If you're watching the show, you know by now that we are a very conservative household, and we were both raised with conservative, right-leaning values, and a lot of that, is the typical a stereotype, pro-life. We're very, very anti-abortion, and things like that. We are very church-oriented. So we believe that our church should have a 501c3, that they should be separate from the government. We are very
pro-Second Amendment.
Yeah, pro-Second Amendment. We are very constitutionalist, and it's hard to argue that the Democrat Party right now, and I don't want to alienate people, because if there's some people in our audience that are left-leaning, I praise you for watching our show and
right.
Listening, and I think there's room for that, and we could have a cordial discussion with left-leaning policies. We're not anti-left. I want to make that clear, but it's hard right now in the last, I would say, the last 2 Democrat presidents. It's very hard to say that the Democrat Party is pro-Constitution. Right. For anything from signing executive orders to bypassing Congress to everything that you can imagine, just disregarding amendments totally in the Constitution. Right. So it's hard to say that you are that a Democrat politician is pro-Constitution right now. It's very hard to find those. So laying those things out, why do you think it's important that we share our conservative values and we share our ideals, and why they are closely aligned with the biblical values?
Right. So, there's a lot to dissect there. I think that it's extremely important as conservatives to share our values. First off, because I do believe that morally, that the conservative values are definitely aligned with a good moral compass. Biblically speaking, but just generally speaking, morally, I feel like that is one of the reasons that we are so conservative. And it's funny because you say, we're conservative and that's been a big part of our upbringing. I feel like it almost is a very solid part of my identity, so to speak. I'm the kind of person that just walks outside and I'm like, yes, I love living in this country. I love being in this free place. I love being in this place where people who have come before me, my father and my brother, my grandfather, they have served our country and they have kept me free. And I love being able to just live here and be in that. There's such a patriotic aspect to being conservative. And I think that that's super important. I see a lot of young people these days that are like, I'm embarrassed to be American. I can't even fathom being embarrassed to be an American. I love this country so much. And it's not to say that the country is perfect by any means. And it's not to say that there aren't bad things that happen in America. And it's not to say that even there aren't really sly politics going on or anything like that. It's not to say that, but generally speaking, this country is free and we fight for the rights of people. We look for those who are down and out and we try to help them up. That's something that it's such an inherent part of who I am, just being an American and being free. And I think that really lines up with the conservative values that we carry in this household, but I think, in the party itself, in the conservative party itself. So I think it's really important to talk about these issues, to talk about things, because I think that when we stay silent on issues, when we stay silent on things, especially like abortion, when we stay silent on these things, not only do facts get misconstrued, that as a conservative who is pro-life, that we are anti-women's rights and that we don't believe in freedom of our own bodies and things like that. Not only do those facts get misconstrued, but I think that it allows people that are louder, that talk really loud, so to speak,
Mhm.
to kind of embed their opinions in those around them because they're talking so loud, because they're yelling,
Yeah.
because they're really reaching out with what they're saying. And when we sit quiet, it allows that kind of atmosphere to increase. It allows that kind of atmosphere to grow. And so then what we see is like an indoctrination of our children because they all they're hearing is this behavior from people who really have anti-conservative values, so to speak.
Yeah.
And they're yelling the loudest and they're speaking the loudest and they're doing the most talking. And because of that, you're just seeing this generation rise up that really has no moral fiber. These young people that are graduating high school and they have no concept of moral value.
Mhm.
So I think that that's one of the reasons why it's so important to be vocal and to be
Yeah.
active in your community with what you believe. Um,
I
I
think to bounce off that, I think that when we are vocal, it kind of balances and kind of brings people back to some sort of central location because not only do we see this loud minority
Mhm.
of far left ideals and big government, I think that still today majority of Americans don't want big government.
Right.
Um, but it seems like that's their only option because that's all they're hearing.
Right.
Um, but I think that when as conservatives, have a louder voice and they do speak up, it prevents things like redefining terms. I think
Right.
that's a big problem that we
Mhm.
have in our political sphere right now is redefining of terms.
Right.
Like you've seen everything being redefined, like racism,
Mhm.
other things like oppression and rights. I mean, we were talking about women's rights. I mean, the, like even if you take it to the most like current thing with COVID, you have uh, uh Fauci on CNN saying that you have to mask up as a vaccinated person because you're infringing on the right of somebody not to be sick. Like I,
Right.
I
Right.
mean like that's not
Silly.
goes against the very definition, I think. So like if we continue to allow these voices to be the only ones heard, then eventually it's going to redefine our whole society
Right.
as a whole.
Right. And I think that allowing things to go so far, um, really kind of it brings it more to like a confrontational point where it could be where things are solved because we're talking about it, because we're discussing it, because we're debating it, because we're saying, this is the positives of what I believe. And then they're saying, well, this is the positives of what I believe. And you're coming to this understanding, talking to somebody who believes differently than you or who thinks differently than you. Instead, what happens is people stay quiet for so long that it kind of bubbles up and then
Hmm.
it comes to like a confrontational head. And I think that we're starting to see that happen in America. You're starting to see a lot of people who are just at this point um they've heard so much liberal garbage, so to
Yeah.
speak, that they're getting to the place where they're just saturated in it, and they're so tired of hearing it that they're starting to push back aggressively.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really it's an unfortunate side effect of not speaking up. It's an unfortunate side effect of not holding on to and really fighting for the rights that we have in this country, for the freedom that we have in this country, and for the moral behavior that we want to see out of our country. I think that that's an unfortunate side effect of that. So you're starting to see people, I can't even think of how many times in the last few weeks that I've heard somebody say like we're headed for another civil war.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's a scary thing to think that we have come to a place where the liberal voice has been yelling so loud that the Republican and conservative voice is starting to feel like the only way to solve this problem is going to be through physical confrontation. And that's unfortunate because
Yeah.
we should be able to talk to each other. We should be able to say, this is why I believe that women should have the right to abort babies. And we say, well, this is why I believe that those babies have a right to live.
Yeah.
And so that is an unfortunate side effect of staying quiet.
Yeah, I think we've allowed a competitive. I get it's not a competition, but for lack of a better term, we've allowed the competitive edge to be to the Democrats or to people who
Right.
don't think like us because we've allowed them to have the platform. They've
Right.
had the platform,
Right.
so they can say that we are not pro-life because we're pro-war,
Right.
and we don't believe that the women have a right to choose,
Right.
stuff like that. Where our arguments aren't even being heard. We're
Right.
just told what we're thought, like what our thought process is,
Right,
and
right.
what we believe is being narrated by the other side.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and I get that a lot. Especially being pro-life because this kind of seems to be something that we brought up a couple times, but I get that a lot from people that I know who are pro-choice. And one of the things they say to me is like, "Well, what are you doing? What
Yeah.
are you doing to make America a better place so that these babies have like a safe place to be born into?" And my response to that is, first off, it's not your business what I do. What I do unto my God. I do for my God because of the standard that He holds me to, because of what He calls me to. But I also do it for my church, for my community, for my family. But I certainly don't do it for recognition.
Yeah.
Right. So I never think that that's really anybody's business to say. But in the same respect, if you are pro-choice, you're pro-choice for a reason. You think that something is wrong. For instance, Simone Biles came out just this last week, and she said that she's pro-choice, and that if you think about adopting, if you're considering adoption, remember that the foster system is incredibly corrupt. It's messed up.
Yeah.
And she says, I know that, coming from someone who's been in the foster system. And to me, that was just such an ironic thing to say,
Right.
because I'm like, how can you, as an Olympic gold medalist, somebody who is arguably the best gymnast in the world, who has come out of adversity, overcome that adversity because of opportunities that you were given to live,
Yeah.
to be alive. And you've overcome the adversity that you were born into. You overcome the adversity that you lived in, and you have made something incredible of yourself. So such an ironic statement to me to say, I'm pro-choice because I come from the foster system and it's really corrupt. But to me, if you're a pro-choice person and your problem is the foster care system, what are you doing to reform the foster care system? What are you doing to change that system? Are you fighting for cheaper adoptions?
Yeah.
Are you fighting for programs that allow parents to learn and to change their behaviors? And it's crazy because a lot of kids spend years and years in the foster care system, and it's not necessarily because the system is corrupt, but it's because their parents won't sign away their rights
Yeah.
to those children, and so they can't get them back. But those kids also can't be adopted, and that's something that we've seen, that I've seen a lot personally with friends of mine and family members of mine who have adopted out of the foster care system, and it's been a year's process. So instead of arguing for aborting these babies who, now we know as great family and great friends of ours, instead of aborting these babies, let's talk about how we change the system that we have so that these babies get adopted into homes with people who want to raise them and who
Yeah.
want to be with them.
I think that's this topic abortion, I think is a perfect topic to kind of tie together what we've been talking about, and how it's gone far too long with the other side having a voice.
Right.
So it to the point where you can justify killing a human life because they might have trials in
Right.
life. Like,
Right.
I mean, just if you let that sink in, some people justify abortion just because of the circumstances they might be born into.
Right.
And to me, like, if you just have a 5-minute discussion of the other side, you can bring that back and you say, come back toward the center a little bit. Like, I mean,
Right.
we can argue whether or not government should intervene in abortion. I mean, that's a civil argument that we can have.
Right.
But saying that, oh, it's justifiable because of the circumstances you might be born into, I
Right.
mean, that to me is just so far from reality and so
Right.
far from the sanctity of life.
Mhm.
And so I think that kind of is a good time to talk about how conservative values line up right now, as we see in our political climate right now. If you were to line yourself up politically with biblical values, it would definitely be more toward the conservative side
Right.
than the left side or the liberal side.
Right.
And why do you think that is? What are some of the conservative values that we have that line up with the Bible?
Well, I think something that's extremely important to us as conservatives that you see biblically is marriage.
Yeah.
I think that's something that is ignored a lot in today's society. It's funny because one of the things that I kind of like to do is I'll jump on our local news station and I'll just see like the births of babies born in our area throughout the week, and it's incredibly common to see half or more than half of the babies being born to families that are not married, to couples that are not married. And I think, that is such a crazy trend to me. It's not something that you would have seen, 20 years ago. 20 years ago, all of those births, or a majority of them would have been to married couples. And I think that the sanctity of marriage is something that's extremely important to us. The value of marriage, the value of having a two-parent household, the value of having a father in the home. Those are all things that we are very passionate about, but also is a biblical aspect for us. It's something that's very important to us religiously, but it's also something that's very important to us in our political beliefs as well. The sanctity of life, which we've already talked about, that's a really important value to us. It's an important value because it is God's right and only God's right to take life, right?
Yeah.
So that's an important value to us. I think that morally, integrity is something that is important to us. It's something that I think that you see really a lot out of conservatives when we see a politician who represents us behaving unbecomingly or doing something wrong. The first thing we do is call it out. We're like, whoa, 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 whoa. We expect more out of you. You are a conservative politician. We expect you to stand up with this moral fiber. We expect you to stand up with this backbone. We expect you to behave with integrity.
So real quick to contrast that, to play devil's advocate, how do you justify us going after somebody like Andrew Cuomo, but then still legitimize former President Donald Trump?
Well, I think you have to look at the difference in the situation. And first off, I like disclaimer, I want to be clear that me personally, I don't like Donald Trump. I think policy-wise, he was a fantastic president. I think most of the things he did as far as policy is concerned, as far as upholding the Constitution, as far as even placing constitutionalists into the Supreme Court, those are all things that I value. And I think that policy-wise, he made one heck of a president. So, he did more for Israel than most presidents have done in recent history. He did more for the Black community than any president has done in recent history. So I think that it's very important to note that policy-wise, he was a great president. But personally, I don't really think he's that likable of an individual. I think he is very arrogant. I think he's very he has a very rich boss mentality, and I think that conflicts a lot with regular people. I think that conflicts a lot especially with the moral character that we have as conservatives, because for us it's like, whoa, how dare you say that, But I think it's important to note that much of the things that Donald Trump got kind of a lot of flack for, or a lot of negative feedback for, were things that he said years ago. And I think that it's important to recognize that and you've even talked about it on the show before, that as our society changes, so does what we find acceptable to say, the jokes that we find acceptable, the terms that we find acceptable. Even things that were such common terms when I was growing up, just 20 years ago when I was a kid, there were terms that we use that now, if you say, people are like, oh my gosh, how could you say that? That's not a term that we use anymore. That's not an acceptable thing that we say anymore. So I think it's important to note that what he was doing as far as his behavior towards women, or his speech towards women, a lot of that happened a while ago. It wasn't something that happened
As Ben
during the
Shapiro says,
election process.
it was baked in the cake.
Right. And so when Donald Trump started running for president, we knew that that's who he was, and we knew that that's who he had been, and we also saw the change in his behavior from 20 years ago when he was making those statements to now. And I think it's also important to note that the things that he said, those particular things that I think we're kind of alluding to that he said, particularly when it comes to women, those things were said far before he ever even was running for office, years and years before he was running for office.
So what's that fine line? Because it's kind of funny, because you said that policy wise, Donald Trump was a heck of a president, and President Biden is now getting a little bit of flack for saying that Governor Cuomo, as a governor, was a hell of a governor. So what's that fine line of why would something like saying like that would be not really kind of tone deaf to the situation, but saying that President Trump was a heck of a good president?
Right. So I think that the biggest difference is that what Cuomo did, he did while in office.
Yeah.
He was not, these are not things that he did 20 years ago, and they are just now coming to light. And he's like, listen, I've made amends. I've changed my life. These are not things that happened, years and years ago. These are things that happened while he was in office. So while the hardworking taxpayers of New York were sending 20% of their paychecks to pay for his massive salary, he's sexually assaulting women. And I think that that's the biggest difference, that he did these things while in office. And I think also it's easy for President Biden to say that Cuomo was a heck of a governor, our Emmy-winning governor who's sexually assaulting women on the side. He was so to quote, a hell of a governor. I think the reason it's easy for him to say that is because he doesn't have to be a tax-paying New Yorker. Yeah. So I think that it's really easy to kind of form that opinion when you're not part of the pie that's being baked. When you're not part of the situation, it's easy to make that kind of assumption that he's been a good governor. And for the most part, he has had a high approval rating in New York, but most of that high approval rating has come, unfortunately, from our big cities. And if you look at really anywhere that is like your blue collar, hardworking, middle class New Yorkers, you're hard pressed to find somebody who is a Cuomo supporter. Yeah. And I think that it's important to note that, as nice as our cities are, which is an ironic statement because I'm not a big fan of our cities here in New York, but it's great that we have these big cities and that we have people who are a part of those big cities. But I think it's really important to note that the backbone really of New York is our blue collar individuals, and it's the people who are plowing our roads and who are laying down salt. It's the people who are out there every day, who are in our military. We have our military base here. It's our people who are out there every day just serving in those blue collar jobs. That's what keeps really the state moving and the state going. Our nurses, it's not like our nurses are getting paid a ton, but let me tell you, we have some great nurses here. These are the people who are the backbone, I believe, of this state. And it's very hard to find those people who are Cuomo supporters. Yeah.
I definitely think it's more of those hardworking blue collars that keep America, like we say New York tough. Yeah. We say that here. And those are the kinds of people that make New York tough. It's not It's not Sally who's trying to do something in Broadway.
Right.
on off Broadway in New York. I mean,
Right.
I love New York. Don't get me wrong. I love the city. I love the opportunity that you can get in New York. But
Mhm.
I honestly think that i- if you contrast New York, especially the city, now 20, 30 years ago, like, I mean, when we had those conservative values 20, 30 years ago in New
Right.
York, where you could actually do whatever you wanted, it was a city of dreams. It was the
Mhm.
city where you could make something of yourself. Where it's kind of hard to do that now
Right.
when landlords can't even make ends meet because they don't get
Right.
any money from their tenants. So, like,
Right.
you see
Yeah.
kind of like the opposite of kind of New York being flipped on its upside down now. And
Right. And I think that kind of goes back. It's funny. I think that goes back to what you said earlier. Is there any room for socialism in the Conservative Party? And I think that New York is a great example of why there's not room for socialism in the Conservative Party. Because I think it's as Christians and as conservatives, it's very important for us to help those around us.
Mhm.
It's really important for us to donate to our soup kitchens, to donate to our clothing closets, to reach out to those that we know of that are in need. And in fact, at any time that we personally hear about a situation, the first thing we do is, how can we get involved? Like, how can we help? Because it's important to us to note that people fall on hard times, that people go through situations that sometimes it's their fault and sometimes it's not, and it doesn't really matter. What matters is that we as Christians, that we as conservatives reach out and we help with that. And I think that when you take that away from the American people and you put that in the hands of government through the form of socialism, it makes people first off inactive.
Mm.
They'll say, well, why should I help you when you're receiving benefits from the government? Why
Yeah.
should I help you when you're on WIC or you're getting food stamps? Why should I help you when you don't have to pay for your own health insurance? Why should I do these things? It makes people become inactive because we feel like
Yeah.
what's happening is
Wow.
someone's already they're taking our resources
Yeah.
already, and then they're handing it out in a way that we don't really like. So I think that's a great reason why socialism is so unacceptable in America and in the Conservative Party, because it's not the job of the government to offer handouts. It's the job of everyday Americans to reach out and hand up.
That's such a
Um,
good point, I think, as like you hear one of the main arguments, people that are typically not Christian, who are either atheist or agnostic or whatever, they say, how can you be a Christian and be against socialism because socialism helps everybody. It's for the benefit
mhm,
of everybody. But the thing is like you bring up such a good point. I think socialism has, I mean, we've seen it throughout history, but just take it for what it is. It has the opposite effect,
right,
right? Because if everybody's getting handouts from one central location, that means nobody's helping each other.
right,
That means all the helping is coming from one place.
right,
So there's no obligation for you and me as Christians to reach out in our community, to have a soup
right,
kitchen, to have like a
right,
clothing closet, because everything is being distributed already.
right.
So like it leaves no room. It
Mhm.
leaves no room for us to be the Christian that we're called to be.
Right. And we've seen that even in our local community.
Yeah.
We've seen that when we've held events, when we've held food handouts and giveaways and things like that. And you see not as much participation as you would expect. And that's because government is already meeting the needs of people.
Yeah.
Government is already coming in and meeting those needs. And what happens is that pulls us away from each other.
Mhm.
We're no longer as people connecting with one another. We're no longer being a part of one another's lives. We're no longer changing the situation for one another and being
Mhm.
there for one another. We say like, oh, if you need help, what's the first thing I hear from people, especially like on Facebook? Does anybody know someone who can help with this situation? The first thing I see is government intervention.
Yeah.
Have you contacted this program?
Right.
Have you contacted that program? And to me, that's so unfortunate, because what they should be saying is, have you reached out to the local churches?
Yeah.
And so now we've come to a place where people aren't reaching out anymore, where people aren't becoming a part of each other's lives. And it reminds me of a story that my dad has often told of a family who moved into the area that he lived into as a kid. And the pastor, the pastor of their church, got wind that this family was in desperate need, and when he got there, they were so destitute that they were feeding their children dog food because that's
Wow.
all they had.
Jeez.
And the local church stepped in, and they quite literally changed this family's life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we should be seeing. We should be seeing that, not do you need food? Have you contacted your local government assistance?
Yeah.
It should be, have you heard about the food pantry at this church? Have you heard about the clothing closet at this church? Have you heard about what they're doing to make a difference in the community? And so as conservatives, and especially as Christian conservatives, we're standing there ready to reach out and ready to help. And socialism is stepping in and saying, hold on, just give me your money and I'll take care of it.
Right.
And that has really caused a rift in our community and really a separation of us as people, as a people coming together as a community.
Yeah. I totally agree, and I think that it's so hard to even think about. I mean, I think that people who are pro-socialism and pro-communism are so short-sighted because they don't understand how it can be used against them.
Right.
And the Bible's very clear about government and how, we give what we owe to Caesar.
Right.
But we're supposed to be the hands and feet.
Right.
We're supposed to be the ones, because we have that accountability.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
like if we give everything to our government, if we give everything and rely on our government to take care of everybody's needs,
Mm-hmm.
they don't have that accountability.
Right. It absolves us from our responsibilities.
Yeah, they don't have the it's not like Fidel Castro had a Bible next to him and he was like, okay, God, how can I use all the money that was given to me?
Right. It's not like we as tax-paying individuals are standing there like, excuse me, how are you using this money again?
Yeah.
No. Once it's in their hands, it's in their hands. And we lose our responsibility as individuals in our communities, and then they have no responsibility because there's really nobody there that can do anything about it. Once the government has your money, they can use it for gender education in Pakistan.
I think the data, I mean, if you use other nations as an example, and people just combat that and say, well, it wasn't implemented the right way, or, the power was corrupted and things like that. Well, I mean, you can use even more data and more points to prove that the other way is better, that free market is better, because time and time again, over the course of our free market system, conservatives and Republicans have always contributed more to non-for-profits, to charities, time and time again. And
yes,
it's because
and that you can look up and prove.
Yeah, you can look up and prove.
This is not like facts we're just like
it's
pretending happen.
It's not to put us on a high horse.
Right, no.
It's to show what our motives are and what our values are.
Right.
Where, if you tend to be left leaning, you're like, okay, well, if I just pay my taxes, then my money will be put to good use. I don't have to give to a charity.
Mm-hmm.
Where, we've seen especially our government. Our government isn't going to be any better at socialism than any other government.
Right.
I mean, they can't even ensure Social Security is going to be there for us. So I don't know why you would want to instill and entrust our government with that.
Right, especially when you see like so much back and forth with our government, it's you wake up and you're like, I wonder what side of my president I'm going to get today, or I wonder what side of politics you're going to get today. And you see that, you go back a few months ago and Kamala Harris was saying Joe Biden shouldn't even be considered as a candidate for president because of his sexual assault allegations from women.
Right.
And then a few months later, she was saying, I'm honored to be the vice presidential nominee for him, and he's going to make a heck of a president. And you're like, really? I mean, what changed other than the fact that you just got picked for VP? So I think when you see so much back and forth in the government, how can you even possibly depend on them to be honorable or to use your resources in a way that's going to benefit the American people? And that's something that's so scary, because a lot of our resources are being used to benefit American politics versus American people, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, it is. It's very unfortunate. So, kind of our overall topic here that we're talking about in this segment. What are some other biblical values that line up with being more of a constitutionalist and conservative. Even though our ideas and principles aren't perfect per se, but how do they more line up with the biblical viewpoint than the other side?
Well, I mean, like in what way? Like what? Give
So
me an
I
example of what you're
so I
thinking.
guess that if I was to take like the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, the freedom of press, assembly, and
Hmm.
speech, how is that idea more aligned biblically than suppose limiting speech and cracking down on hate speech and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, I personally, I think that one of the big themes of Christianity, I don't know if theme's the right word, but one of the big things for me with Christianity is that freedom
Yeah,
is kind of the basis of everything. We're talking, freedom freedom from what we struggle with, freedom from any kind of strongholds or things that hold us back. We're talking about freedom from sin. So I think that a big part of being a Christian is really celebrating and walking in freedom, and I think that that is echoed through our conservative values, through our belief in what the Constitution says. So it's very important to us to have freedom. It's very important
hmm,
to us to have rights, to have those things available. Whether we choose, you can say, I choose not to be a gun owner, but
yeah,
you have the right and the freedom to own one. And
hmm,
I think that that's a big part of being a Christian, is that you can choose to walk in freedom
yeah,
and you could choose not to, but it's always available for you. It's
yeah,
always there. And I think that that's a big part of how our belief really kind of bleeds into our politics.
yeah. Yep, I agree. And um, also further, I think that our biblical viewpoints and our biblical values need to be uh, involved in our political values. So,
Right.
um, what do I mean by that? I mean, like for example, I take Sodom and Gomorrah as an
Hmm.
example, where the Bible lays out exactly the things that were gone wrong and why
Right.
God judged them.
Hmm.
And a lot of those things can be tied to political viewpoints, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
like allowing homosexuality and
Hmm.
bestiality and things like
Hmm.
that. Those are
Immorality. Right. Right.
immorality. Those policies were put in place by, the people there, and
Right.
it created a corrupt society.
Right.
So that's why you see kind of uh, the whole purpose of this show and the whole purpose of why I started this was to kind of intersect those two things. I
Right.
think that you got to have your political and biblical values kind of intersect,
Right.
or whatever you think your faith is. It
Hmm.
has to intersect. Your morality has to
Hmm.
intersect with your political values.
Well, and I think that, and I know that you've said this before on the show, but if your moral values don't come from God, then they are constantly changing. They
Hmm.
change with society, and that is a dangerous place to be, because morality doesn't actually ever change. The
Yeah.
law of God is consistent. God is just. God is not changing. And so when you take a moral value and you base it on anything that changes, and really I think the only example of justice that is unchanging is God. I don't,
Yeah.
I don't think you can see that example
It's
anywhere
almost like the
else.
gravitational pull,
Right.
like right. So like if we think of God's morality and God's morals and values as like kind of like the center,
Right.
and we're kind of like in orbit around it,
Right.
we're constantly being pulled back to that as
Hmm.
Christians.
Right.
Because if we allow ourselves to drift, if we just follow our own instincts, if we follow
Right.
what we want, then we'll be far off. We'll be in a
Right.
different galaxy.
Right. And that's why the basis of your political views always needs to have that moral ground, that moral firmness in God, because he's not changing, because
Yeah.
his expectations of us don't change because times change. His expectation of us doesn't change because humor changes or because laws change. His expectation of us is steady. It's
Yeah.
a standard. And upholding that standard and living to that standard keeps us morally centered. It
Mm.
keeps us from one day waking up and saying, you know what, this thing that I thought was wrong for so long actually is okay. That's not to say that there's not compromise in some of our political beliefs. I mean, even you and I have had political discussions before
Mhm.
where we've heavily disagreed on something, and then we've talked it out. We've shared our sides with one another, and sometimes we've come to a really good compromise, and other times we've still said, you
Yeah.
know what, we're just gonna have to agree that we have different opinions, and it's not always a life changing thing. It's
Yeah.
not like always a huge deal, but sometimes there's just things that we won't always agree with one another on. But at the end of the day, because we have that moral backing, the standard of
Mhm.
our morality is the same.
Yeah.
So we're not going to look at each other and disagree on the sanctity of life because
Mhm.
our moral standard stays the same. So I think that that's why it's so important to have that. When we say that God, it's in God that we trust. Like
Mhm.
that needs to stay there.
Yeah.
It is in God. When we say one nation founded under God, like those are things that we personally believe, but that
Yeah.
politically you have to have because without a an unmoving standard, without a steady standard, your moral fiber becomes compromised every time you're confronted with something. And especially if you don't know if you don't know your moral value, if you don't know the standard that God presents, it's so easy to say, wait, why do I disagree with this, or why
Yeah.
do I
Yeah.
agree with that? Because we haven't founded ourselves in that unmoving place.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I love it that you brought up the fact that that our motto forever has been in God we
Hmm.
trust. And I think that's so important because America is such a great place where that in God we trust, that could still mean something to you even though you
Right.
don't have a belief in God.
Right.
You know what I
Right.
mean? So like I mean I don't want to kind of diminish our worldview or
Right.
anything like that, but you can have a different worldview and
Right.
that still relate to you
Right.
because of the consistency. And that was the whole
Hmm.
point of the founding fathers and the whole
Yes.
purpose of the conservative party is that look, we're not trying to enforce our religion on you or our
Right.
beliefs, but what we're trying to do is build a nation based on these morals and
Right.
ethics that are rooted, that are grounded, that are never changing.
Right.
And that's how you have stability. That's how you have free
Right.
enterprise. That's how you have the freedom to be who you want to be. You can be an atheist and
Mhm.
reap all the benefits of that morality.
Right.
So,
Something I remember going to in college because of the community that we live in. There was a Thomas Jefferson impersonator. He dresses and then he talks and he
yeah.
kind of like overviews the life of Thomas Jefferson, but from the perspective. So he says, I, Thomas Jefferson, did this and believe this, and so on and so forth. Something I learned about him in that performance is that Thomas Jefferson was not actually a Christian, and he did not believe in God. However, he did keep a copy of the New Testament with him, and he read the words of Jesus because he believed that the moral character that Jesus presented was so good that he wanted to live his life and policy wise
Mhm.
act by what the words of Jesus were. So even though he didn't actually believe in God and didn't believe in Jesus as the Savior, as the Messiah, as we do,
Mm.
because of the moral character of what Jesus said, he still kept that word with him and would read that and meditate on that. And I think that that's really important when you say that we have this moral ground. And it's not to say that we're forcing our Christianity upon everybody, but it's to say that this morality, it's based on something that is honorable and it's based on something that is steady. And everybody can benefit from that.
Yep.
Everybody can benefit from living a life with more integrity.
Yep. Exactly. Yep. That's great. So, kind of switching gears, but still along this topic, is there room for we've kind of toted up and puffed up our beliefs and our conservative values? What are some areas on the other side of the aisle that we could kind of uh be okay with and that are kind of like there's no wiggle room? So like Like, I mean, we've already talked about abortion. We think that there's absolutely no wiggle room for that. Like,
Right.
well, there's no compromise. That's kind of like a gateway of kind of being the anti-morality that we're talking about.
Mhm.
But what are some other viewpoints of the left that can kind of help us be brought back to the center without drifting too far to the right?
Goodness, it's hard to say because the leftist is so it's so far gone at this point
It's
that
not organized right
it's
now.
right. It's really hard to say.
Well, I should say it's organized with their coalition, but as
Right.
far as like their policies are
Right,
always ever
right.
changing.
They are, and that's I think why it's really hard to say specifically this is a policy or a behavior that they have that we can really compromise on because you really don't know what identity of liberal you're going to
Yeah.
get for the day. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So it's really hard to point that out because it is ever changing and it is ever moving that it's really hard to say, well, this is for sure going to be their stance because more than likely by the time you've figured out their stance, they've already taken it a step farther. And so it's really hard to say that. And that's not to alienate the liberal community. It's just really hard to find something that they are standard on that we could say, well, in this area, it would be, we could talk through a compromise. Um, I know that it compromises not beyond what we believe, and even it's funny, like even something such as the war on drugs is something that I've even compromised my opinion on,
Hmm.
just from talking to not just talking to other conservatives, but talking to people who are not conservative. My opinion on the stance on the war on drugs has changed. So it's not that our ability to change or to adjust our opinions isn't there. It's just really hard to kind of know, I guess, what the liberal morality of the day is in order to say specifically this is an area that we could
Yeah, and
compromise
it's
in.
more of the problem of like the political leaders and the people
Right.
who have been elected.
Right.
I think that if we were to have a conversation with the everyday liberal thinker, I think that
Right.
we could have a lot of compromise
Right.
and
Right.
we can meet in the middle. But I think, like, kind of like going back to bring it full circle, what we talked about at the top of the show, I think that we've allowed the left to go too far left.
Hmm.
I think that there was a time where the left has introduced uh a political program or a governmental program that has kind of worked in the short term,
Hmm.
where conservatives wouldn't have done that if it was just up to them.
Right.
But now I think we're living in a time where I think the left has gone too far left, that the
Hmm.
conservatives need to actually do something, not just fight, but to actually stand up and to kind of bring people back to the
Right.
center.
Right. And I think to kind of like really drive home like what I'm saying as far as the the liberal party just keeps going farther and farther is if you're talking 5 years ago, boys were boys and girls were girls,
Yeah.
and now we've come to a place where boys are sometimes girls and girls are sometimes boys, and then we've come to a place where actually sometimes they're not really anything, and now we've come to a place where we've got recommendations that there shouldn't even be gender on birth certificates because kids should be non-binary until they can choose what they want to be,
Yeah.
which is not only contradicting of science. It's not only contradicting biology, but it contradicts morality. It contradicts God. It contradicts how He made us. You think God got confused when He made you a boy or He
Yeah.
made me a girl? Of course He didn't. God didn't get confused on that. So, and that's where we mean the moral fiber is always changing. So it's hard to say. Could we compromise on a certain issue? Well, can we? Because we don't even know where the stance is today, and who knows? Tomorrow we will all be walking around as they thems because it'll be illegal to use he or she. So it's really hard to say really how fast it's changing, how fast the behavior of the left is changing. It's really hard to say where we're going to be tomorrow.
Yeah.
But I think that yes, I think you're right when you sit down and you talk to individuals that identify as Democrat or identify as liberal. I think that you can come to a place of compromise. I think you can come to a place where they say, I understand that. And where you can say, I understand where you're coming from. And then you can talk about the benefits because I think at the end of the day, a lot of your everyday, I'm not talking your politicians that have grown up in in the political field, or your generations like your Bushes and your Cheneys, but I'm talking about your everyday average American who identifies as a Democrat or even a liberal. I think they, at the end of the day, they want good things for other people.
Yeah.
And it's just that we disagree with how to get those good things, and even sometimes what those good things are. So when you can sit down and you can have a conversation and you can say, the reason I don't agree with government intervention is because I think it's our responsibility to intervene. I think you can agree on that. I think you can come together and you can say, how do we as individuals intervene in our community? So I think that you're right. You can sit down and you can have these conversations with one another. And I think it's important that we start doing that.
Yeah.
That we start doing that, because it's not about just what our government tells us. It's not about just our elected politicians, but it's about how we as Americans interact with one another and how we as Americans identify with each other.
I think that's a good point that you make, is that I think that both sides have been guilty of this, where they make their political ideas kind of like their identity,
Right.
where they have to align at a side.
And there's no, if I compromise with you, it changes who I am, and that's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
There are good. I think that extremes of any kind are almost always a failure.
Yeah.
The extremes of anything are almost always a bad thing. So I think that it's a bad thing for us as conservatives to say, well, there's no compromise, or there's no room for compromise, because there is room for compromise.
Yeah.
There is room for disagreement, and there is room for being able to come together even though you disagree.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we come together as Americans and not come together as, here are our political leaders.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
So I feel like a lot of people point to a person or point to a group of people or a coalition that they identify with and say, these are my people. Like, these are who represent me. No,
Right.
Americans need to come together with other Americans.
Right.
I
Right.
feel like our political climate, we've just allowed our politicians to just duke it out
To
and
be an identity for us.
Right.
Right. Absolutely. I agree with that.